made her the highest paid performer in history. But before making the picture for 20th Century Fox, Elizabeth was obligated to appear in one more film for MGM, playing a prostitute in Butterfield 8. On September 9, 1959, Elizabeth returned to Los Angeles with Eddie and her 3 children. Shortly after filming began, Elizabeth's health once again became an issue. She suffered from migraine headaches, delaying production.
She just seemed to have a series of illnesses. Some people are just prone to illness, yet she always came out of them strong, looking more beautiful.
Despite her ill health, Taylor delivered a powerful performance in Butterfield 8, while Fisher remained loyally at her side. By the spring of 1961, the beginning of production on Cleopatra was plagued by one crisis after another. And during the delay, Elizabeth developed a serious case of pneumonia. So serious that doctors gave her little chance of survival. The media jumped all over the story, turning Taylor's illness into an international death watch. Elizabeth endured a difficult tracheotomy operation, hovering near death for 3 days. But Taylor's resilience was becoming as legendary as her name. And within 2 weeks, Elizabeth was out of the hospital and on the mend. "I had a chance to read my own obituaries," Taylor said. "They were the best reviews I'd ever gotten." Not only was she alive, Elizabeth's public image was transformed virtually overnight, from home-wrecking pariah to courageous survivor. While Eddie Fisher nursed Elizabeth back to health, she received word that her inspired performance in Butterfield 8 earned her a 4th Oscar nomination. This time, she won.
Elizabeth Taylor.
On April 17, 1961, 29-year-old Elizabeth Taylor accepted the Academy Award for Best Actress, acknowledging a thunderous standing ovation from her peers. Elizabeth called the prize a pity Oscar, but critics felt the award was genuinely deserved. 4 months later, in August of 1961, 29-year-old Elizabeth and 32-year-old Eddie Fisher departed for Rome, where production was finally underway on Cleopatra. The all-star cast included Martin Landau, who will never forget the first meeting with his celebrated co-star.
I found her very direct and very real, actually. When I met her, there was no pretense.
Elizabeth and Eddie Fisher settled into a 14-room villa in Rome. The couple decided to adopt a 9-month-old German girl named Maria. Despite the joy of motherhood, the next few months were anything but joyous. Elizabeth later described that period as the most chaotic time of my life. She faced a production marred by mismanagement, turmoil, and outlandish cost overruns. Despite the hectic production schedule and family demands, Elizabeth's dedication to Cleopatra was never in question.
She was very professional, always prepared, and always ready to do it.
The role of Mark Antony was played by the product of a dirt-poor Welsh mining family, 36-year-old Richard Burton. On January 22, 1962, Taylor and Burton filmed their first scene together. Cast and crew could feel the electricity between the two actors.
When she met Richard Burton, it was literally love at first sight. Richard was living with his 2 daughters and Sybil in a mansion on the outskirts of Rome, given to them by the filmmaking crew company, and Elizabeth was living with Eddie Fisher and their 4 children in her estate, and the inevitable happened. And it was, in fact, as people say, it was love, and that was the tragedy, because both of these families were going to be broken up.
Rumors spread like wildfire on the set as the intense affair escalated into an international incident. When the True Hollywood story continues, the Taylor-Burton romance goes public.
Kissed her as he moved to the chair, and I saw all this in the mirror, and I said, "Oh boy."
And later, Elizabeth tries to tame an uncontrollable addiction.
Richard Burton's drinking, which she simply couldn't overcome. She just couldn't sit around and watch him kill himself.
In January 1962, 29-year-old Elizabeth Taylor and her Cleopatra co-star, 36-year-old Richard Burton, began a torrid affair. Elizabeth's fourth husband, the ever-faithful Eddie Fisher, was odd man out. Elizabeth Taylor's track record with men was no secret to the public, and outsiders thought her relationship with Richard Burton was just one more passing fancy. They were wrong.
I think her interest was purely that Eddie Fisher was waning, she was a long way from home, she was in Rome on a very boring year-long shoot, and I think almost out of boredom she took Burton to her bed. Then what happened, which was amazing, was they fell in love.
Rumors swirled madly in Rome, and by February 1962, Eddie Fisher could no longer ignore the gossip. He confronted Taylor about her affair with Burton. "Is it true?" Fisher reportedly asked. "Yes," Elizabeth said softly. Columnist James Bacon.
Elizabeth didn't like the idea of living in sin with Richard. She had kind of an old-fashioned moral value. I mean, she had a lot of husbands, but she always married them. You know, she didn't go much for that in-house living, which has become so prevalent in Hollywood.
Cleopatra co-star Martin Landau agrees.
The interesting thing about Elizabeth is she had many marriages, but she was always loyal to the one man she went with, as opposed to marrying one person and sleeping all over town.
Of course, Taylor was still married to Eddie Fisher, and Richard Burton was married to his wife Sybil. The Taylor-Burton affair fueled an unprecedented media onslaught.
At the time of the making of Cleopatra in the early 60s, the Burtons became global celebrities. They were really precursors to the kind of media craze that surrounded the Princess Diana. And the Burtons were almost the first ones who achieved that level of celebrity and popularity. I think part of it was just the pure scandal. People like gossip.
But this was no ordinary scandal. News of the Taylor-Burton affair even reached the Pope, who condemned the couple's behavior in an open letter published by the Vatican newspaper.
Well, it's a great love story, obviously. It certainly captivated the world's attention. It was a very passionate moment in time for those two, and it was hot.
So hot that members of the paparazzi went to extreme lengths to capture the famous couple on film.
And we were sitting having drinks while we were waiting to do a scene, and there was this big wall behind us, and they were lighting this scene, and when they put the arcs on, the big lights, it revealed about 30 photographers hanging off of this like cliff and hanging onto things. A couple of them dropped. It fell about 30, 40 feet. I mean, it was unbelievable. They were there with their long lens cameras.
The scandalous Taylor-Burton liaison continued to sizzle as filming finally wrapped on Cleopatra in June 1962. With Cleopatra in the can, Taylor followed Burton to Mexico, where he was scheduled to appear in Night of the Iguana. Elizabeth was not content with simply having an affair. She wanted to marry Burton, and Eddie Fisher stood in her way.
I remember once in Puerto Vallarta, Elizabeth was trying to get Eddie to sign for a Mexican divorce, and he wouldn't do it. She offered him $1 million in cold cash if he would sign for a divorce, and he wouldn't do it. So I got Eddie Fisher on the phone in Beverly Hills, and I says, "Eddie, I can't believe you turned down $1 million. He says, "I am still married to Elizabeth Taylor." I says, "Eddie, let me be the first to tell you that Richard Burton's down here having a hell of a lot of fun with your wife." And then finally, after a while, the judge there decreed that Eddie Fisher had deserted Elizabeth Taylor and granted her a divorce.
The divorce was final on March 5th, 1964. Taylor was free to marry Richard Burton, whose divorce from Sybil 4 months earlier was not nearly as contentious. On March 15, 1964, in Montreal, Quebec, 32-year-old Elizabeth Taylor and 39-year-old Richard Burton became husband and wife. In the spring of 1964, Richard Burton starred in Hamlet on Broadway at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater. The public fascination with Liz and Dick was insatiable. Every night at the theater was a mob scene.
The whole of Times Square queued up to see the Burtons. If you wanted to see Liz, who came to the stage door every night to greet her newly married Richard, it was like a royal progress.
Can anybody today stop traffic in Times Square the way she did? I mean, they heard she was coming in Broadway. Times Square just filled up.
For the next year, Taylor and Burton worked steadily, together and separately. To the outside world, their personal relationship seemed solid, but the foundation was beginning to corrode.
Richard Burton, being Welsh, I mean, he loved to drink, and he admitted it. He'd get off, but he said, I can't live without this stuff. It's my lifeblood.
Taylor, intent on impressing her husband, joined in.
She drank, I think, at first to keep up with him. I don't think she really cared so much about it, but she was determined to prove to him that she could match him drink for drink and be one of the boys.
In 1965, after 3 years of marriage, the world's most famous couple co-starred in their most memorable film, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Burton, 40, and Taylor, 33, played a middle-aged couple plagued by alcohol and verbal abuse.
The fights were too real suddenly. Virginia Woolf, the movie, became the real story. They were tearing each other apart, and when I last saw them together, it was kind of terrifying because they really were taking chunks out of each other, emotionally, mentally, spiritually.
People wanted to think that what they were seeing on screen in Virginia Woolf was really art imitating the real-life marriage of Burton and Taylor. Probably there was some truth to it. She had said openly in interviews that they had huge rows and seemed to enjoy having rows. So the kind of verbal tension that underlines the relationship of the characters in the film.
Taylor's fiery performance in Virginia Woolf wowed audiences and critics alike.
She won her second Academy Award for Virginia Woolf, and what looks so astonishing is that she was willing, at age, I think she was 34 at the time, to make herself look middle-aged. She'd put on weight for the part, she'd braid her hair, so she was very much trying to downplay the glamorous, beautiful movie star image.
The dysfunctional, brawling couple portrayed by Elizabeth and Richard in the film was painfully close to reality, and alcohol was the root of the problem.
The drinking was continual, it was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that was always going on.
And when Richard Burton was drunk, he was violent.
I saw him misbehaving to her and even misbehaving to me. If you got him after lunch in the afternoon, he could be really quite mean.
The years 1965 to 1967 were professionally successful for Taylor and Burton. They starred together in Dr. Faustus and The Taming of the Shrew. 1968, however, was a disaster. Richard Burton was fired from the film Laughter in the Dark because he was late every day due to his alcoholism. The loss of the role triggered a drinking binge. Elizabeth underwent a partial hysterectomy, and on November 22nd, her father, Francis, passed away. In 1970, Elizabeth Taylor's remarkable life took another turn. Her 18-year-old son, Michael Wilding, married Beth Clutter, and 10 months later the couple welcomed a baby girl, Layla. Elizabeth was a grandmother at the age of 39. Taylor embraced her granddaughter with the same love and devotion she heaped on her children.
I saw her with the Wilding boys. I saw her with Mike Todd's daughter. She was great. If you didn't know who she was, you just think she was like a good suburban housewife mother. She was very conscious of protecting them. I mean, it was like Mother Earth.
Mother Earth, unfortunately, could not rescue her husband. Richard Burton was running wild. He was drinking heavily, and he was fooling around in public with other women.
I think ultimately it was the drinking, not the sex, but the drinking, Richard Burton's drinking, which he simply couldn't overcome. Elizabeth Taylor correctly said, look, you're killing yourself, and I'm not going to be a co-conspirator to your death. She just couldn't sit around and watch him kill himself.
In 1974,